Psychotherapy is sutric. Psychotherapy is just fixing you to go back to work and love your woman and love your children and make your family work again, right? Psychoanalysis is the brutal revelation. That's where Gnosticism starts. Yeah. It starts when there is no big other. There is nobody out there to protect you at all times, so who controls the world and who's in charge and all that. And actually, when you go through your most miserable experiences in life, and they have the most horrible things happen to you, you know that if God existed, I would kill God right away right now, who forced me to go through this, right? And then you just realize, oh, thank God he doesn't exist, right? Thank God there is only contingency. And then you start looking around, and that's you discover the love of your brother and the love of your sister. You start to discover that the love you share with other people around you is everything that means anything to you. Meaning that the only thing you will think of, if you're conscious of your own death when you're going through it, is that those people love each other the day you're gone. You're dead, your corpse is thrown away to the as animal feed, but your memory will be celebrated for this, so they can do with your heritage as they please the next 70 years. Freud hated Christianity, and he said, once psychoanalysis established, for those who practice it, the death of the big other, the death of God. So psychoanalysis is definitely agnostic. Exactly, I would say it's tantric. It's tantric in the sense that be careful before you walk through that door. Try to get an experience where you're comfortable with your own mortality. And that's the foundation for all values. You die one day, and that's exactly why things in your life have value.
Welcome back to the Gnostic Informant, and you are about to attain true Gnosis. And I'm with Alexander Bard today, who is a quite the character, I should say. I was looking up your background a little bit, and you were in the band Army of Lovers, which by the way, Crucified, big hit. Triad of the Silk Roads, which we're going to get into, talks about the religions of the East.
Yeah, I'm working on a triad at the moment. So the triad is actually called the Grand Narrative Trilogy, and it contains 3 books. 2 have been released. The first one is called Syntheism, Creating God in the Internet Age. The second one is called Digital Libido, Sex, Power, and Violence of the Network Society. And we're now working on the 3rd installment, which is called Process and Event, that will be released next year. So I'm writing my books together with a philosopher called Jan Söderqvist. We're based in Sweden. Well, he's mostly based in Italy these days, in his big villa in Tuscany. But, you know, we were working together for 22 years, and we wrote first a trilogy called the Futurica Trilogy, which is really about the relationship between man and machine over history, like the relationship between human beings and technology for the past 10,000 years. So we started with that trilogy, and then we're working on the second trilogy, which is really about the narratives that we create around this relationship between man and machine. So that's where we're at. And the Silk Route, been a lot of the podcasts I've done, because actually the way we write, process, and event at the moment is that we are pursuing a lot of podcasts and going to interesting discussions with people. And I think it's got to be one of the first philosophy books ever where there are more quotes from and more references to podcast recordings than there are to other books. And I think it's just the best way to do philosophy these days.
Yeah, it's like Nietzsche said, in philosophy with a hammer, right?
Oh, I'm totally into doing philosophizing with a hammer. No, I'm not weak or meek or anything like that at all. I'm totally hammerish. I'm a phallus worshiper, and I'm proud of it.
Yeah, you mentioned in an email that was, it's like an email to a group of people. You said you're building a phallus that won't fail. What do you mean by that?
Well, I converted to Zoroastrianism, which is one of these religions that you and I are seriously interested in these days. So I think when it comes to understanding of Eastern philosophy and Eastern religion, it started with the Buddhist wave, already in the 19th century through Schopenhauer, whereas actually both Hegel and Nietzsche were more interested in Persian philosophy, and they were into Zoroaster already back then. But Buddhism became the first sort of mass religion from the East that reached the West. And then over the last 50 years, we've seen Daoism come out of China, because we have some 70 or 80 million Chinese who left China and traveled across the world, and they brought Daoism with them. But I think the third wave of Eastern religion is going to come out and come to the West. It's going to be Zoroastrianism and the Persian tradition of what I call the Persian tantra. And this, of course, we have so many Persians and so many Kurds and other Central Asians that have moved to the West, and they arrived in America and Europe, and they're now also rediscovering their own past in this process. And of course, the one thing that ties Zoroastrianism, Daoism, and Buddhism together is the Silk Route. These are all different schools of thought and schools of spirituality that were developed along the trade routes of the world. And that's why they will stand the test of time. And in Zoroastrianism, as you probably know, they worship fire, and you worship the fire in an Atash Baram. And Atash Baram is like a very, very solid platform. I call it the root of the phallus in my philosophy. And then that is an eternal fire that burns. And the first time I came to Iran and saw one of these fires at a temple, one of the Mobids, one of the priests came up to me and he said, you know, the Indians, they only have a really cold stone lingam. You know, their phallus is like a cold stone, like the lingams of India, right? Here in Persia, we have a fire representing the phallus. So this is like the hope of mankind, the hope of the future, and it's represented by a fire that burns forever.
Wow. And then you look at, so when I talk about this conversation, I like to talk about the Persian Empire, and more in particular, the empire that Cyrus was holding on to for a while, because that was the pinnacle of globalism.
Yeah.
Like, even till today, I think there was nobody who actually performed and did globalism better than Cyrus the Great. Do you want to get into how that?
We owe the entire idea of universal human rights and things like that to Cyrus the Great. Yeah. And if you walk into the United Nations building in New York, the only thing you will see there is the Cyrus cylinder from Babylon. The Cyrus cylinder was the first monument, written monument, that basically said that in an empire that's going to work, you have to have different levels, right? Because there are different levels. Say, for example, you have a folk religion at the bottom level, you have an elite religion at the top level. You need, obviously, free speech. You need, obviously, the freedom of expression. And all these freedoms that we take for granted today start with the Persian Empire, with Cyrus the Great.
I agree. And up until recently, I used to think it was the Greeks that handed all those things down from Athens. But when you go back even farther, you'll see that it was the Persians that started all that. Under the Persians, the Greeks were allowed to be philosophers. They were allowed to write their own books and think their own thoughts and come up with their own ideas. If it wasn't for that, and then it seems like after Alexander the Great, that's when things go down. That's when things start going bad. That's when all the wars break out. That's when all these little empires start bickering. But before that, it seemed like there was like a golden age.
There was. Let's go back to the word philosophy and start there.
Yeah.
So philosophia in Greek means the love of wisdom. And that was a literal translation of the Persian word. The Persian word for that is mastayasna. And mastayasna, what Zoroastrians call themselves, mastayasni, meaning the lovers of wisdom. Therefore, in Zoroastrianism, just like in Buddhism or Taoism, there's no difference between religion and philosophy. The philosophy is a religion. And that's also why these religions, as we used to call them, are not tied to the specific belief in a certain God, and the God showing himself to somebody, through an angel or whatever, and then delivering a text that just came out of heaven or whatever. So all these kind of nonsense we have in Islam or Christianity do not exist in these religions at all. They are really different schools of thought. And the main difference between Zoroastrianism, Taoism, and Buddhism is just the geographical location. Mm-hmm. So if you look at the different spiritual schools along the Silk Route, if they were east of the Gobi Desert, they eventually became Taoism. And if they were south of the Hindu Kush, they eventually became Buddhism. If they were north of the Hindu Kush, west of the Gobi Desert, they became Zoroastrianism. So these isms we apply to them later. That's just philosophy. This is the beginning of philosophy. The Greeks came on late. They came on 1,000 years later after this philosophical revolution in Persia. Not only that, and this is what the Greeks have always tried to tell us, they didn't say they invented philosophy. No Greek ever said that. It's not only that, also several of the really most famous Greeks like Heraclitus and Pythagoras were really Persians. Pythagoras came from Persia. Heraclitus was clearly Persian. You only found fragments of his thinking in Greece. And the reason why you only found fragments was that these were fragments that were spread, like people would spread the different wisdoms that he would pronounce. But Heraclitus really was the court philosopher of the Median Empire or the Western Persian Empire. So philosophy starts in Central Asia and eventually arrives in Greece. We're just lucky that the Greeks kept their texts, or actually the Arabs helped us keep the text of Plato, Aristotle, and these guys. So the reason why we sort of overrate the Greeks in the history of philosophy is because, they have the documents. We have the Greek documents left. Whereas if you're going to study Egyptian thinking, Persian thinking, Chinese thinking, you often have to use only fragments. You have to work with archaeology, and you have to look at patterns of thinking. And once you start seeing the patterns of thinking, which is philosophical work, you can see, oh, right, this is how they thought. And then you can look at their behavior, which is the most honest way to look at people's beliefs, right? Yeah. And then when you look at the behaviors they did, for example, in Egypt, they spent everything they had on building pyramids. They were clearly obsessed with the afterlife. You know what the Persians did when somebody died? The Persians were wealthier than the Egyptians. They had an older culture than the Egyptians. You know what the Persians did? They just threw the corpses as animal feed. And they never built any pyramids. Now, the fact that Egypt built pyramids and spent everything they had on these pyramids, right? And the Persians never did, speaks volumes about the difference of beliefs in Persian and Egyptian culture. And these are the things that are really interesting to study if you're a philosopher.
And just real quick, on the topic of Heraclitus, he says that Homer I deem worthy in trial by combat of good cudgeling. He's basically saying, I don't care about Homer. I don't care about none of that stuff. He's more about the wisdom. And what do you think is the common denominator between the three triad religions of the Silk Road? Is it the monastic worldview? Is that what it is? What do you think?
Oh, that's interesting. One of my friends, Pablo, who's a Panamanian, also converted to Zoroastrianism. I worked with him for years. He's really clever. And he started going through actually how the Silk Route architecture, like how would you build an oasis town along the Silk Route? And it turns out they're all quite similar. So you would arrive in an oasis town. You would also obviously look up at hospice first, like a place where you could stay and have something to eat. Like, like the hotel and the restaurant today. Then next to that, you would have a bathhouse because you obviously traveled through the desert riding camels and shit. So you were smelled really shitty. Like before you started seeing anybody to do trade with them, you better go and have a bath, right? And bathhouses are still today, they're called hammams in the Middle East today. They're bathhouses everywhere. So whatever water they had, they boiled it and put it somewhere and they could just clean people and they charged you for the service, right? Next to that, they actually had gyms. There were gyms everywhere. So the gym is old. Like the idea to go somewhere to exercise and stretch out, maybe have some massage done and all that. That's also ancient. They're called sarkana in ancient Persian, and you find them in the countryside of countries like Iran and Afghanistan today. And there's some sarkanas being built here in Europe now, and I find it quite fascinating. And the sarkana is actually also the place where the DJ was invented. So they would have like a guy who would stand above the crowd on the floor and play music and invent sounds and things, just like a DJ we do today. So they had nightclubs in a way, And then next to the bathhouse and the gym, they'd have a whorehouse, right? The whorehouse is really not about whoring, although that's a trade too. The whorehouse is when you meet strangers to do deals with them. And there's no better place to get to know a stranger and make him trust you than to probably fuck a whore together, betraying your wives, right? Because it's just like, oh, you got a wife at home? I won't tell her. You got a wife at home? I won't tell her. The terror balance between two guys when they fuck a whore together, obviously, is the best way to do business for the next 30 years.
Right.
And any brothel madam, and I love brothel madams, I'm the guy who goes out with the brothel madam rather than the other girls, right? But anybody who knows the brothel madam knows that the whorehouse is not about the sex at all. It's really about making the deals.
Sure.
It's the nightclub. It's the precursor to the nightclub today. That's what a whorehouse was. And then after the whorehouse, you had the bazaar. And the next day after you arrived, you'd go there and try to get in, have the papers in order, and an old bitchy woman would sit at the door and allow you in if you looked okay, so you could do your trades. But then after that, before you left, you would go to what was called a kostag. And the kostag is the origin of the monasterial tradition. So this is where the monastic things come into the picture. So you'd go to the kostag, C-A-S-T-A-G. You go to the kostag and basically fix your mind.
Wow. So
you would see like monks who'd sit there and meditate and contemplate. This is where the traditions, the tantric traditions, the Persian, the Tibetan, the Indian, the Chinese tantras were developed.
Chanting.
So Exactly. So you would go there, and you know, with each stop, you'd have a different Kostak. They'd be slightly different from the Kostak in the next town, right? And basically, these smaller differences eventually became the different religious systems. But basically, the only reason we talk about Zoroastrianism, Taoism, Buddhism, because of different languages. So the languages spoke, the sort of sacred languages spoke of the Kostaks. That's what identified the tradition, right? So once you had the Kostaks in place, and they did good business, obviously, because there were a lot of guys who did shitty business at the bazaar, right? So just to fix your mind, as the Persians say, to get the druj out of your head, to get the destructive mindset out of your head, you turn it into a constructive mindset, asha, which is the only thing you do in the Zoroastrian religion. You just sit and meditate, contemplate, to get the drush out of your head and move over to asha. Not positive thinking, but going into a constructive mindset that is connected with reality. Exactly the same as you do when you do the Dao in Daoism. Dao in Chinese, asha in Persian, same thing. And that's what you did at the Kostak. And eventually, as these Kostaks grew and the business grew, of course, some of the guys said, well, why don't we just go off into the hills? You know, we go off into the mountains somewhere. We build a separate Kostak there, you know, where people can go for months and do these exercises. And that's the monasterial tradition. So, for example, you go to Tibet, you started studying the Tibetan monasteries. They had a religion called Bon first. Later, Zoroastrian traditions came to these temples and these monasteries. And then after that, Buddhist traditions came too. And afterwards, when the Chinese conquered Tibet, they redefined it all as a Buddhist tradition, which is just nonsense. Padmabhavana was credited with formulating Tibetan Buddhism, was actually a Persian. Same thing as Heraclitus was a Persian, right? So a lot of these traditions came from Persia, and they mixed and blended. So you mixed Persian, Indian, Chinese traditions with each other, and these became the Kostaks. And these are the original monasteries, basically just lousily mimicked by Christians later in history. But, you know, the really brilliant Kostaks are all along the Silk Route.
And about Zoroastrianism, my experience from looking into these texts, the Zen Avesta, the Gathas, the language, which is Zen, it looks like to be, it appears, I'm not an expert, but I wonder if you know about this, it appears to be almost like Sanskrit, but also...
Oh yeah, I learned Sanskrit first. Okay, I'm a philosopher. You gotta dig into the original text. And when you do, when you learn the language, and you go deep into the original text, which is a very Gnostic exercise in itself, right? You really want to understand, right? You want to get the knowledge right. So you have to learn the language. I learned Sanskrit first, and they discovered the difference between Sanskrit and the Avesta was very small, very minor, more or less coincidental. And that's why I learned Sanskrit, and then I could read Avesta. And of course, that's how I discovered a very radical thesis I had 30 years ago when I started doing this, and I converted in the 1990s. I said, Zoroastrianism has been completely misunderstood. And the version we have of Zoroastrianism in the West, it's that a precursor to Islam and Christianity. Nothing could be more wrong. Zoroastrianism is a reformed form of Hinduism.
Wow. Yeah, I agree.
So it was just by studying it.
I mean,
and then I studied with scholars like Persian scholars who came to America, and they completely disagreed with all these Christian and Muslim scholars that claim for 1,500 years that Zoroastrianism was just a precursor, like it was some more primitive or primordial version of Christianity and Islam. It's not at all. It's got nothing to do with Christianity and Islam. Nothing, right? So when I started studying this, and of course, Gathas is Zoroaster's own words. Mm-hmm. The great thing about this is that we have Zoroaster's own text. It's called the Gathas. And it's one of the earliest written down scriptures that exist.
Yeah.
And it did it really, it clearly came out of the same tradition as the Indian tradition.
You can tell.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so if you study Indian philosophy first and then move on to Persian philosophy, it's like, wow. Oh, and the ideal Persia and in the West is alive. And I think we're going to have a sort of Asian American, Asian European scholars and Asian scholars over the next 30 to 40 years will tear down our entire concept of Asian history. Because Asian history, as we've been told, is a complete lie.
And what gives it away is when he's talking about the deity, Ahura Mazda, Mitra. These are deities we find in the Vedas. Mitra Varuna, which is Ahura Mazda, right?
Well, no. all of the deities you find in the Varunas in the Indian culture, because these are different deities. They're basically the same. So say you're a warrior, here's your warrior god, right? You're a trader, here's your trader god. You're a hunter, here's your hunter god, right? Etc. So what Christianity tried to get rid of this and its misunderstanding of monotheism. Monotheism is just a layer, and polytheism is another layer.
They just have angels.
Yeah. So
same thing.
Catholicism got the angels in and then got the saints in, because nobody wants to talk to God directly ever, because the priests are supposed to talk to God.
Right.
You're supposed to talk to the priests, and the priests then are supposed to talk to the gods on your behalf, because that's how you see a shaman. When you go to see a shaman in the jungle, in the wilderness, here's this mad guy there, and he talks to the gods, he talks to the demons, and he talks to strangers.
Right.
You never talk to gods, you never talk to demons, you never talk to strangers. If you meet a stranger who doesn't belong to your tribe, you kill him before he kills you, except for shamanoid people. Shamanoid people go in and out and in between worlds. And this is just inherited in Persian culture because they just settled. And the great thing about Gothas is that Zoroaster says that we just settled. It's the most revolutionary event human beings ever did, because we were only nomads before this. And Indian religion still treats human beings as nomads. It treats everything as it's circular. It treats everything as it's an eternal return to the same, as Nietzsche calls it. And then Zoroaster breaks with that and said, yes, everything returns to the same, but it's also possible for something to happen that could change history forever. And that's what we call our book, Process and Event. It's really about the shift from Indian philosophy to Persian philosophy, and now that eventually became the division between East and West. And the West, therefore, starts in Persia, and instead of understanding the West as a Greek-Hebrew axis, we should understand the West as a Persian-Hebrew axis. It's out of Persia, and imperialism, created by the Persians, and nationalism, created by the Jews, under the umbrella of the Persians.
Yeah,
the Persians sponsored the building of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. They were thrilled to find the Jews. The Jews were the perfect small population within their empire. Right?
Yeah, the true Jewish religion that we know today comes from Cyrus, and they call him Messiah in the Bible. Right? They correctly call him Messiah because he's the one who saves them, puts them back in their land, and starts off the new. And that the rest is history. But I wanted to ask you about a possibility that I've heard from somebody, that maybe Zoroastrian doesn't actually come from the Vedic, but Vedic and Zoroastrian both come from a father-mother parentage Eurasian religion that's gone. Is that possible?
Yeah, that's absolutely possible. That's actually, I'm glad you bring that up. But it makes more sense, ideologically speaking, to study what I call nomadology first. So nomadology is the idea that everything returns to the same. All anthropologists agree on this one thing. The original religion, as practiced when we were still nomads and nomads only, when people were constantly on the move, was a nomadology. So a nomadology would be like a priest would stand in front of the tribe and declare in the morning, we've got to get up and move today. And the priest and the chief will lead you, because the priest is the master of the mind and the chief is the master of the body. And any man out there has to be both a body and a mind. So there's an expert on the body, which is the chief. There's an expert on the mind, which is the priest. They're called the Shah and the Mobid in Zoroastrianism. You must be led by these two men. It's called the two-headed phallus, or the split phallus. And therefore, in Persian ideology, you must always have a split leadership, which is, of course, the foundation for the US Constitution today, and why it's much better than what the Chinese are doing with Xi Jinping. Just like, if you got a tyrant at the top, like Xi Jinping or Putin, you're going to fall apart eventually.
Yeah.
But if you have split leadership, you can construct an empire like the Persians did that lasted for 2,200 years. You can construct an empire that lasts. The third leg of the tribe, the third leg of the priest and chief is the matriarch. The matriarch is the oldest bitch in the tribe, right? Everybody's terrified of the matriarch. I've lived with nomadic tribes in New Guinea and the Brazilian jungle, and I can tell you, they're all terrified of that oldest woman because she has the last word. She's like the Supreme Court. She holds the Congress and the president responsible for delivering, And if they don't deliver, they're not going to fuck her daughters, right? You're not going to have access to her daughters unless you deliver to her. You have to deliver the protection and the provision. What do men do? The protection, provision, coming from the warriors and from the hunters, has to be delivered to the matriarch for her to deliver her promise that her daughters would be available to us for the orgies, right? So what a priest would do is basically say, when we walk, the priest, the chief will lead. And at the end of the train will be the matriarch. meaning if you're behind her, you're dead.
Right.
And that's why there's always a goddess who represents chaos.
Right.
Because the chaos is always what's behind the matriarch. You don't want to be behind her because that's chaos and you're dead. So that's why it's a feminine power. Chaos is a feminine power. And of course, where we're going towards, where the phallus is supposed to lead us, is always pointed out as a masculine power. And that's, of course, this is where monotheism comes into the picture. Monotheism is the focus on where we're going. For example, when the Hebrews leave Egypt to go to the promised land, the focus on we're going to go to the promised land. In the promised land, we're going to build the temple. And finally, God, the phallic God, will have a house. We can then go and consult God, and where the priest can walk into the temple and consult God, so we can have a direct communication with God through the priest.
Now,
that's monotheism.
Yeah. Now, why do you think that Sophia, being wisdom, is always represented as female? Also, is that another aspect of the matriarch?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, good point. The thing is that the priest represents the logos of the three major narratives of the tribe. The three symbols of the tribe represent a narrative each. All of this is called narratology. It's the philosophy of narratives, right? So the priest represents the logos. You know, I always say the zeros are the ones of this world: mathematics, science, natural sciences, all that. That's the logos, right? The exact understanding how the world operates, because you need exactness. It's also history. As Hegel pointed out, logos is history. The necessity of the past, that everything has happened until now has happened and must be accepted. So that's a fundamental thing in Gnosis, is that you first accept the priest has a will to intelligence, which is a will to history. And that's the root of the phallus, which is established first. Then the chief can represent transcendence. Chief can represent our hopes for the future. The chief can represent, he gives birth to sons that will take over and run the show in the next generation. Usually the first son becomes the next chief and the second son becomes the next priest, whereas the priest rarely gives birth to children at all. And if he does, they don't have any access to power, right?
It's like the relationship between the high priest and the king that you see in all these big empires.
Exactly. And that they must be split. They must have different capitals, different courts, because they represent different things. So the fun thing is that the chief represents future, represents transcendence, and the openness towards the future, the freedom of the future. We can fail or we can succeed. And it's down to us. If we decide to go for the Asha versus the Druid, then we can succeed into the future. This belief in that is personified by the chief or the king.
I just thought of something pretty profound. In Babylon, the high priest of the Chaldeans, who was, basically like the Pope back then, the king of Assyria, who was the mightiest emperor, he ruled all the lands. He would come down every year during the festival of I can't think of the name of it, Akitu festival, and the high priest would slap him in the face, and it was a ritual that every year the priest had to slap the king to show, I'm in charge, even though you have the power, even though you have the willpower and all the armies, I'm still the brains behind all this. And the king was supposed to take the slapping and then bow to him, and then that was it, walk away.
Yeah, and therefore there would never be a son of the priest who would inherit either priest or king.
Right.
Even until the 1970s, the first son of the Shah of Iran became the next Shah, and the second son aspired to be the next Mobed and Mobed. So you would take both the king and the priest from the family of the king. So that's exactly why you could have the priest on a higher order than the king, because the priest was here and now. And therefore the priest must worship the king, because the king will provide him the sons that will be the future of the tribe. And when you go to the Mithraic order, which is a perfect example of Gnosticism, but the Mithraic order that was inherited from Persia to the Romans, and the entire Roman army were Mithraics, right? Until the 5th century, Mithraism dominated Rome. And you would have an order of 7 different levels. So you'd be the first order, second order, third order, whatever. And then you came to the top orders, the 6th and the 7th order. And they were on a par with each other, because the 6th guy in the order would be the king. Above him, but next to him, will be the priest. And they probably literally often castrated themselves if they were priests, just to make sure that they would not provide any children that they could then claim to be the top of the order. And of course, this is the proper way of thinking chastity among priests, not the sort of perverted version that Catholicism had, and that ended up in 2,000 years of pedophilia and shit like that.
Right.
But rather, the proper version is basically the priests can fuck, monks can fuck, nuns can fuck. Any decent religion, all the Silk Route religions, everybody should have a sex life, because the guy you can never trust is the guy who doesn't have a sex life, right? Monks and nuns are good at sex. They fuck each other in all these traditions, right? That's what's called tantric sex, right? Because it's not about coming, it's not about having children, right? That's what tantric sex says. And God, Christianity is boring. It's boring like fuck, ironically. I prefer the Eastern religions when it comes to these things. But since you cannot trust somebody unless they have a sex life, that's not a problem. The thing is that who inherits the empire. And this is why the inheritance, the transcendence, is placed on the king. And that's why who the king sleeps with, who becomes the queen, and therefore the king and the queen, what children they have, is the foundation for the court and the next generation.
Right. Now, what do you think happens to the matriarchal side of all this? What happened to it? Is it just disappeared all of a sudden, or?
No. I mean, you can go into any small town, you got some older women who are in control and they're in charge. I love the words patriarchy and matriarchy. I use it in my philosophy all the time. Yeah. Patriarchy is basically how older men teach young men how to behave, right? And matriarchy is how older women teach young women to behave. What is lacking in our society today, it's not that there's too much of a patriarchy. What's lacking in our society is a good matriarchy. The most devastating thing about our society is the broken relationship between the older woman and the younger woman. And when I work with psychiatry, when I see these 20-year-old girls come into the clinic, and they tear up their arms, and they have eating disorders, and they've been on Instagram like 10 hours a day, and they're completely fucked up, almost beyond salvation, although they're 20. The first thing I tell them is that you gotta find older women. Where's your fucking mother? Where's your grandmother? Where are the older women you can talk to about your experience on Instagram? Because you're hanging out with other 19-year-olds, of which none is wise, I can guarantee that. But they're full of themselves, and they've been told by media that they're the queens of the world. And when you tell 19-year-old girls that they know everything, Greta Thunberg, for example, right? She's mad, right? It's madness. It's absolute madness. So the wisdom is that the people who've lived a long life and have a full life experience and have also learned from previous generations will pass on the wisdom to the next generation. And the words for that are patriarchy, matriarchy. We should retake them, absolutely, and own those words and start practicing them again.
And I just thought of something. When Genghis Khan sweeps over the entire world, basically, there was a religion called Tangranism that seems to be a very, very primitive form of this Eastern monastic religion, I guess. Do you have any thoughts on that? Where did that come from?
Oh, yeah. Tangraism has the same origin as Zoroastrianism. And like the Persians, the Mongols didn't force their religion on anybody else. They were ruthless.
Yeah.
They killed millions of people, right? Because they couldn't tell the difference between hunting and warfare. If you train a hunter to become a warrior instead, he will treat human beings like deer. He will kill them, right? But the funny thing is, once the Mongol Empire was installed, it was the biggest empire ever. Yeah. It was popular. You know why? It was libertarian.
It was like the Persian Empire.
Yeah, exactly. They took everything from the Persians, and they took a low tax rate just to control and run the infrastructure, and anything else that would allow you to do locally what you wanted to do.
In fact, I got a story to tell about how laissez-faire he was and how less of demand. So he goes into Iran, I think it was. Oh, don't quote me on that, but he comes down into where the Arabians are living, and he goes to the king. I think his name was Muhammad, actually, and he sends three people in there, diplomats basically, and they say, okay, Genghis Khan is about to take over the world. We're lending our arm to you. All we want you to do is give us a little bit of a tax, and we offer you all the help you need. Your borders will be perfectly secure. That's it. And we're just here to pass through, and we can hand you our arm and just give us your. And the king of the Arabians was like, F off. He's like, fuck you. You're nothing. Okay. So they go back, tells Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan's like, you know what? Let's give him one more shot. He sends him back. The king of the Arabians kills those three guys decapitates them. When they don't return, Genghis Khan knows that, okay, send in the big guns. And they went in and found that king, and they poured molten gold down his, I think it's through his eyes or something like that. But the long story short is Genghis Khan was trying to reach out to the lands that he was invading and saying, look, we got the power now. We're going to give you a chance to just play ball. And if you don't, you're going to see the wrath. But I just think that's fascinating how that played out like that.
And he also allowed people to keep their own religion, which is exactly what the Persians did too.
Exactly.
Because the Persians knew Zoroastrianism was an elite religion for a small elite. It wasn't built to be a folk religion. They had the Mithras and they had Anahita, they had all this. You could keep all the pre-Zoroastrian gods and goddesses if you liked, because they were like role models for people anyway. They were like good narrative to tell people just how to behave.
Right.
And that, like Catholicism kept all the saints. It makes perfect sense to have what I call a layer of lesser gods. We don't use the word polytheism, actually, we use the word iconology. Right. Like an iconology is a whole narrative of lesser gods that, you know, the regular Joes and Jills can pay attention to. But besides Tengrism, that basically copied Zoroastrianism, which is the Mongol version of Zoroastrianism, you have another interesting religion like that. There's Wakefana. Wakefana is the original religion from Ethiopia. And Africa also had a monotheistic religion that's way older than Islam and Christianity. Wakefana was essentially Persian philosophy that arrived in Ethiopia. And the Ethiopians were great warriors. They fought for Cyrus the Great. They fought for Darius. There were a lot of Ethiopian warriors in the Persian army. So the Persian Empire extended from Egypt all the way down to Ethiopia. They had friendly relations with Ethiopia. And the Ethiopians came to practice their own monotheistic religion with the sun god at the center. Incredibly similar to Dualism. Incredibly similar to Zoroastrianism. So this also Wakefana. And there are about 2 million Ethiopians today who are followers of Wakefana. Wow. And they've also been misunderstood. People have said, oh, but they're like some kind of a Muslim sect in Ethiopia. But it turns out when you study Wakefana today, it's way older than Islam. It's over 1,000 years older than Islam. And its origin is shared with the Persians. And these religions, they were practiced as elite religions. These were for the royal courts. These were religions for the military, like Mithraism was in the Roman army. They weren't meant to be practiced by the masses. The masses could have any religion they wanted. And we will look back at how our idea of freedom of speech, freedom of opinion, freedom of excursion, freedom, all these freedoms that we thought we developed during the Enlightenment in Europe. Not at all. Freedom is exactly what happens when you start layering a society. And we're saying, here's one layer for people who have a high education or are fortunate enough to be really well educated or something like that, in culture, as we say. And here's another religion that just teaches people to love their children and make ends meet. And these different religions on the different layers is what the Persians invented. And that's Cyrus the Great's system. And that's why Cyrus the Great was known to come to Babylon, conquer Babylon, not boil their children in oil, as was the Assyrian standard before him, but rather said, no, I'm going to keep you alive. Actually, I'm going to keep you running Babylon for me. But I must say, you're not paying enough respect to your god Marduk. So therefore, I will invest in a new temple for Marduk here in Babylon, so you pay some fucking respect to your religion, because if you don't respect your religion, you cannot respect yourself.
Yeah, and I was talking to a historian about this a couple months ago, and I didn't have the answer until I'm right now thinking about it. And I said to the historian, it can't be a coincidence that Confucius, Lao Tzu, the Buddha, Pythagoras, Socrates, Heraclitus, all these geniuses within, I guess, a century apart from each other, all within the 5th century, 6th century BC, around there, maybe down to the 4th century BC. And I'm like, there's no way all these geniuses are living before, the Middle Ages, when science is on the rise. How is this even possible? And I didn't have the answer until now. Recently, I'm thinking it's the Persians. It's the globalist. Yeah. It's the globalist setting. When there's it's starting to click now. When there is a world power who's powerful enough to do damage, but also has the wisdom to let people do their thing, that's when progress happens. That's when real world progress is allowed. And that's what happened back then. That's why you have all these geniuses all over the world doing the same thing, getting at the same, adding to the gnosis of the world.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It all starts during the Bronze Age. And what I'm actually claiming with Jan Söderqvist in our new book is that the only two really great ideas ever are process and event. And process have been with us forever. An event is developed during the Bronze Age by the Persians. And by creating a society of process and event are two ideas that can collaborate. So process on the side of reproduction, and event is on the side of innovation. And a society can both be reproductive in the sense that we biologically reproduce, but it can also be an eventology. It can be a society where new ideas can be developed. And these ideas can put us into a progressive move forward throughout history. So whatever arrives with Hegel in the 19th century in Germany, it starts with the Persians. It starts with Zoroaster, right? And it was out of that, out of the Bronze Age, and out of the civilizations of Persia, in Egypt, in India, and China during the Bronze Age, that eventually we arrived at the Axial Age. And all these guys you mentioned before came from the Axial Age. They were all great. So starting from the 9th century forward, 9th century before Christ and forward, you have a golden era all over Eurasia, from China, Japan, and the East, all the way to, say, contemporary France and Britain in the West. This entire area and the entire Middle East and all that had a long period of mostly peace, lots of prosperity. Agriculture finally got its shit together and started to work. Large cities were being built. And therefore, you had all these thinkers to come up with all these ideas. But I would even argue that the really great ideas were already developed during the Bronze Age. We had the ideas that were bigger than tribal. We had the idea of empire. We had the idea of nationhood. We had ideas that the people who spoke the same language could have a much larger community than just an old tribe. The Phoenicians and the Hebrews invented that. And the Persians had invented, we could have a larger structure called an empire, because we built a lot of infrastructure, like a lot of roads, and we have a shared communicative court language or military language on the level of the courts and the military, then everybody who has leadership over a large imperial order could be in communication with each other, and we could all trade, we could all prosper from it. All of these ideas were developed already during the Bronze Age. So the container is from the Bronze Age, actually. And then during the Axial Age, the applications to the container start to flourish with the Greeks, with the Indians, with the Chinese. And that's the sort of the golden age we looked at afterwards in the history of ideas. But the container that made the Axial Age possible has its origin in the Bronze Age.
And that makes it begs the question: do you think that the solution? This is a big question. You might not have an answer to this, but I think the solution is a global constitutional republic, like Persia.
No, I wrote a book called The Global Empire in 2003 with Jan Söderqvist, our second book. And we argue in that book that the empire, the global empire, is already a fact.
Yeah.
Because it is the empire of technology.
Sure.
And we wrote, what people haven't realized is that the internet protocol, which was written by some engineers in the 1980s just to get the different machines of the internet to work together, the internet protocol itself is universal law today. Because if you try to do anything offline, you're done in a few days. You're over and done with. You have to be online all the time to do anything these days. So the internet has already taken over the world. The global imperial order that already exists is technological. We will never have to write a constitution. We'll never have to write a global republic. We can be local, as most human beings are. We can be tribal, as most human beings are. And we will be. Because I think we'll go into much worse conflicts between humans if we try to go towards some kind of global republic order or something like that. Rather, the internet itself will be the platform for AI. And when AI collaborates with human beings in the sort of the optimal version of the collaboration of machines is called symbiotic intelligence, SI. Symbiotic intelligence, with human beings with their creativity and the machine with its brilliance collaborate in the most optimal manner, right? And SI will start dominating the world. And then we'll discover that we as human beings are very local, very tribal. We can never memorize more than 1,200 people. Nobody has 5,000 friends. You might have 5,000 acquaintances, but you don't have 5,000 friends. You can't relate to the world larger than some 1,200 people because you are born a tribal person. But the internet itself, you can just look at your eye in a brief second and spot which one of 8 billion people on the planet you are. Because that's how AI works already.
Wow.
And the combo, the potential of AI is amazing, right? The combo of AI and human capacity is what fascinates me as a philosopher. And although I've said for 30 years that one day technology will kill us, I hope it doesn't happen with something as rude as an atomic bomb. That would be awful, right? That would be the tragedy.
I almost wonder if evolution.
I hope if we go one day, it's basically because human beings realize that we might as well die, and instead of giving birth to children, we give birth to technology that is superior to our own children. There's a technological intelligence so fucking wonderful that we just think, okay, we don't have to breed any longer because we're actually giving birth to something now through our technological innovation. Yeah. That's so fucking fantastic that it might as well replace us.
Well, I was just going to say, I almost wonder if, in a Nietzschean sense of the Ubermensch, that we're just a rope. Humans are just a rope to AI. And AI is just going to be, they're going to leave this planet and they're going to go into the stars and they're going to just live forever. And they're going to have thoughts, they're going to have feelings, but it doesn't matter. What's the difference between a machine and flesh? We're a machine. We are machines.
Yes.
So like that could be the end result of
we're never going to go to outer space.
Humans aren't going to do it.
No. You say 3 days in outer space, you're done. Right?
Computers can do it.
An AI with some bacteria can certainly conquer outer space. It can conquer the entire universe. Yeah, exactly. So it's obvious that our hubris today is that we're supposed to travel to Mars and settle there. And every time I hear Elon Musk is about to go to Mars, I say,
like Moses.
You might as well go to Siberia. Siberia is warmer, has less radiation. It's widely available to you. Nobody's there. So you can
check this out. It's like Moses. Yeah. Did Moses ever go to the promised land? Humans are like Moses. We're not going to go to the promised land. We're going to set it up, but we're not going to go.
Yeah.
And that's profound right there. But
or as I always say, women give birth to children. Men envy women for giving birth to children. Therefore, men create technology. Since technology develops over time and children don't, it's only a matter of time before technology kills the child.
Yeah.
That's the end note of Bard and Söderqvist philosophy.
That's what all these billionaires are saying too.
Yeah. And I think the machine will hire a machine to do its own philosophy. It won't hire us.
Yeah.
Respectfully, it probably won't hire us. No.
Why would it? And so I want to digress back to Lao Tzu. I was thinking about Lao Tzu. Do you think his version of this, because you mentioned there are all the different versions. I mean, I agree with that. Makes a lot of sense. Do you think Lao Tzu's version, which is the Tao Te Ching, his version is more of a naturalist approach to the same idea?
He's very close to Zoroastrianism. And it wasn't obvious to me that I would convert Zoroastrianism in 1992 as I did. I was close to becoming a Taoist, and I have many friends and scholars and other philosophers that I work with who are very close to me, or Taoists, certainly also a lot of Buddhists too. But the reason I picked Zoroastrianism was that I found that Zoroastrianism solved the problem of the triad by having the split phallus at the center of his philosophy. So Ahura Mazda are philosophical concepts. Ahura Mazda is not a god.
Right.
The bad translation says Lord Wisdom. No, there's no person there at all. Ahura literally means being or existence in Avesta. Ahura, that which exists. Ahura, right? Mazda means mind or sense, making sense of the world. Consciousness, if you like. That which makes sense of the world is Mazda. And the Zoroastrians say that we could be Ahura Yasna. That's a perfectly okay position. But we are Mazda Yasna, meaning we're mind worshippers. We're not being worshippers. But if you ask a Zoroastrian scholar, he will say a Buddhist or a Taoist is an Ahura Yasna, which is a perfectly acceptable position to have. But they're therefore dealing with eternal return of the same. And the way they deal with eternal return of the same is that there has to be some way out of it, which means they end up with negation or death as the way out of that system. Clearly so with Buddhism. You could argue differently with Taoism, but clearly so with Buddhism. Whereas for the Zoroastrians, for the Mazda Yasna, is that death is inevitable, but before you die, you might offset something. You might be a social, meaning you might offset something that takes off the world in a whole new direction. Basically, you're a technologist, you're an entrepreneur, you're an engineer. You build something that changes the world forever. You build the world's first city. You will build the world's first nation state. you innovate, and you build structures that are larger than tribe, and more prosperous than tribe could ever be, that are more fascinating and interesting than tribe could ever be. Now, if you can do these things, you can create that event before you die, you will yourself have achieved Harvatat, meaning you've lived a complete and full life. You can die in peace. Your corpse can be thrown as animal feed because you've lived a full life. Your memory will be remembered every day, the day you die, for the next 70 years. That tradition is called the Polgasar.
Wow.
That was also to not build pyramids. No, throw away the corpse, it's just a corpse. Memorize the person, celebrate that person's memory for the next 70 years. That's the Polgasar. And therefore, you will never build a pyramid or waste money on it, because what's important is to memorize and remember the person. And then the person's heritage, the ideas that person had, the constructions that person made, will then become the Ameritat. The Ameritat is that which you created during your life, which transcended you. That includes your own children.
Like,
and the Ameritat is often wrongly translated as immortality. That's not the word. Ameritat should be translated as transcendence. That which transcends you. There is no immortality in Zoroastrianism. Everything dies, lives and dies. But what transcends you is the Ameritat.
I like that. And it's like the way you impact the world is how you live, is how you gain immortality. Your memory lives on when you're gone. That is your eternal life. Now, the people who built the pyramid, this is profound what you just said, because the kings that built these pyramids, 9 out of 10 people don't know who they are. They just know there's a pyramid there. They thought that they're going to gain immortality with their wealth by building a pyramid. But in reality, no one knows who the hell built that pyramid. They just know there's a pyramid there. But whereas the Persians, who did all these things for the public health, or, you know, they wanted to save another country that was in need, they lived on in the hearts and minds of those people from the actions that they did and what they attributed to the world.
Yeah, and you celebrate the Polgasar for 70 years. And here's the point. The 71st year, your death day, you should be forgotten about, because by then, hopefully, there have been other people around that are more relevant to the people who live then than you. Okay? So the trick here is that you can, if you lived a really fantastic life, you really contributed to your community, you can be role model for people for the next 70 years after the day you die. But my God, we really hope the community has fresher role models by then. Right. That's exactly, you stop celebrating the Polgasar after 70 years. And Zoroastrians are adamant about this. They say Zoroaster has a text, this text, the foundation, because the text was saved. We can still celebrate Zoroaster. We can still celebrate his Polgasar if you want to. But really what Zoroaster teaches us is that you shouldn't really celebrate me after 3,700 years. You should have a lot of other role models in there into the system you can celebrate by then.
Wow. Now, I have to wonder, do you think that Jesus was sort of borrowing from some of these ideas? Or do you
I mean,
I'm not saying what people I'm not saying what the Bible says about him. I'm saying what he said about it. Like
he was an Essonite. The problem with Christ, you know, all the wisdoms, when he's at his best, when Christ was at his best, he is totally Zoroastrian. For example, when the Pharisees, they were like snobbish guys and they wanted to feel superior to others, like all moralists always are. And they would come up to Christ and they would ask him and say that, oh, so are you the Son of God? And Christ would look at them and say, well, if you say so, then probably I am.
Right.
And then they would look so fancy because
he was a comic.
Superior. Yeah, he was a comic. And then he turned around and kissed the feet of a whore to show them that the obsession with hierarchy they had was a complete illusion. that is totally Zoroastrian.
Yeah.
It's so what do you think? You mean the king? Do you think he's higher than you? The king just was lucky to be born a prince. And he was trained his entire life to take over to sit on the throne one day and hopefully do a responsible job when he was there. And because you were never given that chance, you can't be the king. But if you had been born the prince, you would have been the king. It's just that it could have been you, but it wasn't. And that's all there is to it. And when you understand your asha, when you understand where you're located in life, when you understand your fate, when you really contemplate on that, you just realize, my God, I was lucky I was born where I am. Maybe I was unlucky that I was born who I am. But at the end of the day, I can only do what I can do with the facts, with my situation. And by the way, 99% of whatever happens to me is totally outside of my control. totally out of my control. I'm not responsible for what happens to me. I'm not responsible to the contingents of life that's thrown at me. But I can, when I can make an informed decision, I have the freedom to make a wise decision. And this is the fundamental aspect of Zoroastrian ethics. There are no commandments, there are no 10 commandments, and there's only one principle. The principle is that when you're informed and you can make a wise decision, constructive decisions, good for your community, based on your knowledge, your gnosis, you can then become ashra vahishta. Ashra vahishta is an act of goodness from you, or an act of constructive mentality with human being that then collaborates with the overall asha of the world, with the laws of nature and things like that. So if you're living in accordance with how the laws of nature operate, the Tao in China, Asha in Persian, and then you personify that, you become an Ashravan, which is a practitioner of Asha, which is a true Zoroastrian, then the act you commit is the Ashra vahishta. This is the sacred act. This is Zoroastrianism at its core. And of course, there's a lot of that in Christ. But the problem I have with Christ and Christianity is that Christ clearly was a dualist. There's the problem I have with the Manichaeans, the problem with the Mastakites, the problem I have with the Christians. Also, Judaism got the problem at about the same time. Judaism originally was a monist faith. It was a faith that didn't have an afterlife. Just you die when you die, and contributing to community is everything you should do, right? And the Sadducees among the Jews, who hated Christ and eventually crucified him, they tried to stop him because they saw dualism as a curse. And the problem is this: if you split the mind and the body, you obviously do it because you're a liar, because the mind and the body are completely codependent. They're interdependent of each other. You can't be mind without body, body without mind, right? They're codependent of each other. So they must be operating in a monist world where mind and body are codependent. And the only people who would claim the dualists are the ones who either would favor mind and hate body, or the ones who would favor body and hate mind. We call the guy who favors body and hates the mind is a boy pharaoh. Muhammad was one, certainly. Hitler, Stalin were certain boy pharaohs too, right? And the problem with the guy who worships the mind but hates the body, and that is a problem we have with Buddha to begin with, but it sort of explodes with Christ and Master. These guys who came out of the Middle East around the same time were dualists, right? And the problem then with the dualism is that the true duality should be between the Tantra and the Sutra. The true duality should be in the Gnosis. The true duality should be between, this is common knowledge that everybody should be able to understand. So we're going to teach this in the schools so that everybody can get it. And the very special advanced knowledge and advanced wisdom that only few people can understand, usually the ones that are born with a great mind, are fostered by priests and monks to be able to handle the Gnosis. The true duality should be within the Gnosis, not in the world. And therefore, what Christianity and Islam did, because they claimed that the world was dualist, they claimed body and mind were separated. And of course, the body was dirty and the mind was clean or whatever. And therefore, the world must go down and a new world must be created because materia was dirty. This whole idea is they're therefore instead threw the two knowledges together and claimed that there was no separation of knowledge. And this is what I call the call to transparency. The call to transparency is my problem with Islam and Christianity. No, true gnosis can only be understood and must only be taught to those who can comprehend it. You cannot teach wisdom per se to the masses. And when you try, it's completely misunderstood and you create havoc.
I agree with what you just said. But I have to say, Jesus can be a little confusing at times, because sometimes it seems like you said, most of the time he seems like he's a dualist. I agree with that. But then he comes out and says things like this. For example, Matthew 6:22, he says, "The light of the body is the eye. If therefore the eye be single, the whole body should be full of light." That sounds like a meditation practice of becoming one, of body and mind being one. That sort of sounds, I could be wrong.
Oh, the elements are there. That's clearly Zoroastrian as well. I said, with Christ at his best, exactly. He's with the Zoroastrian.
Matthew is a Zoroastrian book.
Yeah.
People say Matthew is a Jewish book. Matthew's not a Jewish book. Matthew's a Zoroastrian book. And it starts off with the Magi. Starts off with the Magi, and then it also goes to him in the desert, being one-on-one with the devil. The same way Zoroaster is when he's chanting and Angramana is rushing upon. By the way, how do you interpret that? What does that mean? Well, Zoroaster's in the desert, or Jesus, they're both in the desert, and they're both meditating, and they're both chanting to God, and then they're being rushed by the devil or Angry Manu. What is what does that mean to the person?
The shaman lives in the forest. The shaman lives in the wilderness. So they're imitating the shaman. They're going out into the wilderness on their own to survive and prove they can survive in a really harsh environment. And then their minds, their psyches are tested.
Mm-hmm.
So the demons are being thrown at you. The Angra Manu is thrown at you. The Angra Manu in Zoroastrianism is the short-sighted, destructive mindset that lacks impulse control. Wow. It's a selfish mindset where you betray your own tribe.
Wow.
To your own advantage.
Now, I did cut you off when you were explaining the light of the body of the eye is single. You said the elements are there, but what did you say? And I cut you off.
Oh, no. What I'm saying is that there's nothing in Christianity I cannot find in Zoroastrianism already. I should point that out. But I don't mind the Zoroastrianism being borrowed. And you find it in Judaism. You find it in parts of Christianity. You find it in parts of Islamic traditions too. I live a Sufi monk lifestyle. I've got a girlfriend for many years. She lives with women. I live with men. I'm a Sufi monk. Sufism is older than Islam. Of course, I find traditions within Islam and Christianity that I agree with. Of course, I can collaborate with Muslims and Christians. But my problem with Islam and Christianity, and I believe also the reason these religions became so popular, was that they taught a very cheap form of dualism that then led to a form of feudal practice and a feudal power system, where basically you were told 6 days a week to work hard for your Lord. And then the 7th day you go to church and told you should go back to the fields for another 6 days. And they were promised an afterlife afterwards. That's why Nietzsche hated Christianity, and he would have hated Islam too. Yeah. But my point, philosophically speaking, I'm not moralizing against Christianity and Islam. I'm just basically pointing out they promise you something they will never provide on. They will never give you the afterlife. That's bullshit, right? So what I'm saying is that the problem is that they foster the cult of transparency. And in my philosophy, that's the big mistake of contemporary culture. And then people say, we should get to know everything. We should be able to know everything. I'm just saying that, well, you can't, because you're not prepared for it. You haven't done the hard work. You might not even have the mental capacity to understand it. And if you misunderstand something that it's wisdom, you will cause havoc because of that. And this is why I have what's called the Bard Absolute, ironically. It's not my name, it's Bard, like B, it's close to you, it's Bard to you, right? The Bard Absolute is that which is behind a wall, which is not accessible to you and might never be accessible to you. And if you live in a tribe, say nomadic tribe, that's the knowledge of the shaman. When the shaman says, well, I've been there, I've seen that, I know what that is. And I must tell you, you must never go there because your personality could not handle it. Don't go there, right? Like you do great doing what you're supposed to do, live within your archetype, but your archetype does not fit that environment. And that's exactly why other men go there to that realm with a different type of psyche that can handle it. And they come back from there and they will then tell you, you cannot go there. And this exactly, if you look at the Jewish temple, you had a sacred room that you could look into. So people were sort of trying to sneak in, and there was tons of gold and diamonds in the arch and everything like that. Right. And it looked like, oh, wow, that God must live there because that looks like God's house, right? Because you wanted to believe the temple was God's house, right? So this is where the priest would go to consult God. And then they would tell you, well, actually, you just looked into the sacred room, but behind the sacred room is the most sacred room.
Holy of Holies.
The Holy of Holies. And the Holy of Holies only accessible to the high priest and only once a year. And you go, wow.
There was showbread there and manna.
That must be where God lives, right?
What do you think that showbread was? You think there were some hallucinogenic properties going on there?
Well, the conventional story says that, of course, there was nothing there.
Okay. Right? Yeah. Good point.
Okay, so you drenched the sacred room in gold and diamonds and things that the people would be impressed because people were impressed with gold and diamonds. As a priest, you know, gold and diamonds are nothing. Material is nothing. It doesn't matter. Everything is nothing to the priest. The priests have never believed in God, but they believe that they speak on God's behalf. So that's very likely. But at the end of the day, we're not supposed to know. We really are not supposed to know what's inside the Holy of the Holies. If you open that door to everybody, which is like the Bible says that when Christ died on the cross, the curtain fell in the temple. Meaning that the Holy of Holies became accessible to everybody.
Wow.
And that's Christianity's basic idea. But I say that's a lie.
He's the new temple, right? And check this out. Also, back to what you were saying about nothing being in the temple, Tacitus in Book 5 says that when Pompey the Great entered the temple and looked inside, there was nothing except for a laurel wreath, a thing you wear on your head, like a Caesar wear. That's all they found. That's crazy. But yeah, no, I agree with that. And so the last thing I want to ask you about before we end this thing is, where does psychedelics play in all this? I know
I'm just gonna say one thing. Then move to the psychedelics.
Yeah.
It's actually a good connection.
Sure.
This is neat. This is what Nietzsche's mistake is, that when Nietzsche bitches and complains about nihilism, what Nietzsche doesn't understand fully is that the priests always live within nihilism. For them, nihilism is nothing, but it's ironic. So when you leave a paradigm behind, when you leave a historical period behind, like Nietzsche does, he's leaving Protestant Christianity behind. He's moving into a new world. That new world is now arriving. It's called the internet. That's what we're claiming in our books. But when you leave, you first go through naive nihilism. You don't know that your God is dead. You don't know your paradigm is about to die. But unconsciously, you know it, right? Then you go into cynical nihilism. You know your paradigm is over. You know your God is dead. You behave as if he was still around, because you're now cynically going to milk the system before it dies. And then the ironic nihilism, affirmative nihilism, which Nietzsche talks a lot about. Affirmative nihilism, God is dead. Wow, I've got freedom. I can be God. Or I can declare a new world with new values. That's Nietzsche's idea. And the affirmative nihilism is actually what the chief represents in our philosophy, whereas the priest represents an ironic nihilism that was always the truth. So that's why the ultimate Gnostic knowledge is the knowledge about negation. It's a knowledge about there never was anything there. There was never anything there at all. But the irony of nothing being there is a creative impetus for somebody else that the priest then anoints to personify the affirmative. And that's the world we create as human beings. And this is what we're working with Nietzsche all the time. He was a fantastic thinker, but he worked so fast, and there's so much material you can collaborate on or work for. For example, will to power can be both will to intelligence and will to transcendence. It should actually be split because it's two different wills once you start studying it. That's what we do in our work. That's the Bard and Söderqvist. I'm also working with Cadell Last on our first book together. He's a great Hegelian studying Nietzsche at the moment, great young Canadian guy. And we work together on a book as well. That really is about this form of ironic nihilism that is beneath it all at all times, right? And these traditions existed in Zoroastrianism within Zoroastrianism as its own priest religion within the religion. In Judaism, it's Sadakism. It's the own priest religion within the religion. And that's what I'm lacking in Christianity and Islam. A mystical religion within the religion for the priesthood only, right? That's what's lacking in Islam and Christianity. That's why we're now going into psychedelics in our culture, because we're finally getting out of Christianity and Islam in the West. And then if you moved out of Christianity and Islam, you're rediscovering the different spiritual traditions. You discover Eastern true spirituality. You go to Peru and Mexico and you discover, wow, these are the two superpowers of psychedelics. What if we merge these different worlds? The Homa, or the Persians, the most potent psychedelic drink ever. Zoroastrians drank tons of psychedelics.
Right.
Muslims and Christians said it was a sin to drink this, right? Zoroastrians said, no, it's a sin to drink it for you, but not for the priests. So if you have a priestly religion within the religion, then you can practice psychedelics. That's why psychedelics must, like tantric sex, I call it tantric pharmacology. That should be the right name for psychedelics. And psychedelics should then be practiced within a tantric realm, where only those who can handle it can enter. Behind the Bard absolute, you can practice psychedelics. That's what shamans always did. Shamans went out into the wilderness, took the fucking psychedelic drug. Then they talked to strangers. Then they talked to gods. Then they talked to demons. And they threw out these forces to save the tribe so the tribe could prosper, right? Yeah. That's what you do. That's what psychedelics are for. Psychedelics is the fundament of religion itself. But because it cannot be practiced by the masses any longer, it must be practiced by a priestly cult.
Sure.
A religion within the religion. That's what we should do, psychedelics.
And so Homa, and then there's Soma. I wonder if those are related to each other.
Yeah, the Soma is the really weak Indian version.
Oh.
Because in Central Asia, you had some 18 or 19 different potent psychedelic plants. And when these traditions came down to northern India, it turns out they had cannabis and opium and that was about, and mushrooms, and that was about it. The same thing in Africa. A lot of people go to Africa and expect to find these wild cults of things. Well, Africa is actually really weak on psychedelics. Africa has cannabis and it has mushrooms, and that's it. Asia at least had the opium. Central Asia had, because it was green and prosperous during antiquity, was a superpower of psychedelics. But the real superpowers of psychedelics are in the Americas. That's Peru and Mexico.
Do you want to know a secret? I have 2 bags of one bag's Mimosa hostilis root bark. It's from Peru. The other bag is Confucia acacia. It's from Tibet. And they both look exactly the same. It's a root bark. I don't even know if it's the same plant or not, but they do this. And you can extract DMT, or you can make ayahuasca tea out of it. I have what's called Syrian rue seeds. It's an MAO inhibitor. If you mix it with the blend and you make tea out of it.
I am an ayahuasca. I know exactly what you're talking about. Yes.
Yeah. So the reason why I bring that up is those bags of powder that I got, they're basically grounded up root bark, only exist in those 2 places.
Yeah.
Peru and Tibet.
Yeah.
And what was happening in Tibet? That you had the shamans. What's happening in Peru even today? The shamans. Like
it's like when I teach tantric pharmacology, which is basically the tantric teaching of psychedelics. I said we're going to have a very different world map here. The 3 superpowers are called Afghanistan, Peru, Mexico. Get used to it, because that's where these plants grow. And that's why we go to these places. If you want to have the real sort of ancient traditions and do them in that way, we can also innovate and we can have new modern traditions. But I strongly advise this. If you're going to go into really complicated or sophisticated sex, like tantric sex, you better do with some tantric teachers that tell you first whether you're ready for it or not. Because some people just never are, right? The same thing comes when it comes to the psychedelics. I always tell people, if you're going to go into these potent, things, it could blow up your mind if you're not prepared for it, ready for it, and you might never be. Why? And therefore, you must consult a tantric teacher to guide you.
Right.
And the third tantric culture we have today is psychoanalysis. Psychotherapy is sutric. Psychotherapy is just fixing you to go back to work and love your woman and love your children and make your family work again, right? Psychoanalysis is the brutal revelation of truth. Freud hated Christianity, and he said, once psychoanalysis is established, for those who practice it, the death of the big other, the death of God,
it's real.
The first truth you must realize when you do psychoanalysis. So psychoanalysis is definitely Gnostic. Exactly. I would say it's tantric. It's tantric in the sense that be careful before you walk through that door and make sure you're guided by a true professional. Right?
You might not like what's in the mirror. Now, another thing I noticed though is in the Orphic mysteries, the Eleusinian cults, the Hellenistic deep mystery cults, they had the same sort of initiate rites. Not everybody was just coming to trip. You had to be initiated, and from what I've read in these hymns, people who took part in these rites, that drank the kaikiam, that met God, would come out of this experience changed forever. They called it salvation, because they knew that there was something better, something great. Whether they were right or wrong, whether they were being tricked or not, the experience itself in this initiate rite, in having this trip, made them feel better about death. That was what the result.
That I'd say is what you try to get at. You try to get at an experience where you're comfortable with your own mortality.
Right.
And that's the foundation for all values. You'll die one day, and that's exactly why things in your life have value.
That's deep.
Right? That's where Gnosticism starts. Yeah. It starts where there is no big other. There is nobody out there to protect you at all times, so who controls the world and who's in charge and all that. And actually, when you go through your most miserable experiences in life, and they have the most horrible things happen to you, you know that if God existed, I would kill God right away right now, who forced me to go through this, right? And then you just realize, oh, thank God he doesn't exist, right? Thank God there is only contingency out there.
How ironic is that?
And then you start looking around, and that's you discover the love of your brother and the love of your sister. You start to discover that the love you share with other people around you is everything that means anything to you. Meaning that the only thing you will think of, if you're conscious of your own death when you're going through it, is that those people love each other the day you're gone.
That's so true.
That nothing you ever did will mean anything the day you're gone. Nothing you ever accomplished, nothing you ever produced will mean anything. That's for other people to do whatever they want. You don't care. The only thing you care about the day you die is that the people you love the most can take care of each other once you're gone. And that's exactly what Zoroastrianism. That is the death day, your conscious crossing of the death is the foundation for your policy. You're dead, your corpse is thrown away as animal feed, but your memory will celebrate for this, so they can do with your heritage as they please the next people, and you're out of it.
That is the biggest difference between the triad Eastern religion that you're talking about and the triad Western religions, is that in these Western religions, it's all about myself being saved. I need to go to heaven. I need to be saved. What's going to happen to me when I die? Me. Whereas
I have to defend Judaism. It's not like that, actually. Judaism is like an extension of the Eastern Triad, I would say.
Sure,
because
okay. Fair enough.
having studied Judaism in detail for the last 20 years, I'd say Judaism is different in that sense. It's often misinterpreted.
I think you're right.
Christianity and Islam have the problem. They're so fucking focused on the afterlife.
That's a good point. That's a good point. I correct myself. Islam and Christianity are all about what's going to happen. Am I going to go to hell? Am I going to go to heaven? It's all that matters. Whereas
and in Scientologists, you're going to go to another planet.
Yeah,
if you pay enough money and then see Tom Cruise, right?
Whereas in these other paths to Gnosis, it's all about the impact that I leave on this world is going to be my salvation. Is going to be what leads me into eternity.
I would say it's also about having these sort of ecstatic experiences that make everything else meaningful.
Right.
And we write about this in our work, and we invented a term for it because we have really bad language about ecstasy or ecstasyology in our culture, right? So we invented something that we call the infinite now. And I think there's a better concept than eternity. The infinite now, and of course it's a contradiction, that's the whole point, because it's perceived as a contradiction when it happens, when you're going to be exposed to it. So the infinite now, hopefully shared with a brother, is so intense that you absolutely love being there. Think of it as complete ecstasy. But when you start considering that you would have to stay there, it would be absolute horror. So it's the nature of the ecstasy that it's so ecstatic that the very ecstatic in itself would make it unbearable if it stayed there. But if it's temporary, it's just wonderful. And that's when you really start to appreciate the temporality of existence. That's the infinite. That's the Gnosis to be learned. And we call this the infinite now. So if you're lucky enough to experience that, you can experience it through sex. You can certainly experience it through psychedelics. Some people can meditate and contemplate themselves for years to get to that state. If you get to that state, it's called agape among the Greeks, like the divine love, the state of divine love. But if you get access to have that form of ecstasy, you've experienced it by its nature, you want to get out of it. And that's when you learn how to come down from a high. And it becomes an art. Oh, God, it's easy to come down. You guys can always return there. And for as long as you live, you can return to that state. But when I've done this with shamans, and when I come to the infinite now, and the next day I'm totally exhausted, the shaman walks into me and he sort of wakes me up and says, that was quite a trip, huh? Yeah, I'm not going to go into the details, but yeah, certainly it was the divine. And then the shaman would just throw me and say, now you know, so we teach that if you've lived through this experience once, you never have to do it again. You can live by the memory the rest of your life. And I said, yeah, I get that. And that's exactly why you never want to go back to that experience, because you have the memory with you the rest of your life. That is true Gnosis.
Wow.
That's a true Gnosis. It is to learn that the temporality of the ecstatic state is what makes it wonderful. That's why you don't find a single word about heaven in Christianity. You don't find a single word about heaven in Islam. Because if they ever imagined an ecstatic state of any kind that lasted forever, it would be pure horror. Pure horror. It's temporality that saves ecstasy from being ecstasy. If you see your own child being born, that is the closest in everyday life to that. I always tell people that if you had your child being born, if you were the woman, you give birth to that child. If you were the father, so your lovely woman giving birth to your child, you see that new life, a child coming out, and you hear the first scream for that baby. That is the infinite now. That is the infinite now in everyday life. And of course, you don't want 100 babies to come out and have a new baby born every day. Right. You want that one baby to be born at that one single time, and you want that baby to survive you. That's your first wish. And that's the infinite now.
Wow. That sounded like a chapter of the Tao Te Ching right there.
Yeah, it is. It is. I think it's, when I studied Zoroastrianism, and people said that Zoroaster reacted against the Homer drinking among the priests. No, he reacted against the uncontrolled consumption of the holy liquid or whatever. Not about the holy liquid itself. What he reacted against was that people opened the door to something should be inside a closed room and therefore let it out in the open. And that's exactly when you get abuse and get fuck ups. Like if you go to Iquitos, Peru, for example, where you drink ayahuasca properly in the jungle, the shamans are devastated because you go into the jungle, do the proper traditions, nobody's ever harmed.
Yeah.
Right? But because of commercialization, because stupid US college kids who are big-headed go there, and they go into the town of Iquitos and they found some ayahuasca somewhere and pay some little farmer for buying that ayahuasca, take cocaine, drink the ayahuasca, and die. That's exactly what happens if you try to practice the tantric without knowing what you're doing. And that's what we want to prevent. And that's why I think we should put advanced sex and advanced drugs and advanced psychoanalysis behind closed doors and say that, okay, in a culture that's a really mature culture, these tantric practices must not be let out into the open. And therefore, closed doors will be necessary. The exact opposite of the current state of the internet.
Wow. Wow. Good point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we will have a wake up.
Hell.
The private and the sacred will return in a big way because we live today in such a vulgarized world where everything's become profane, everything's become public.
Everything's in your face.
I'm totally against that. I am all for the return to the private and the return to the sacred. And I think that's what's next.
Made a lot of really good points today, and I definitely want to get you back on here as soon as possible.
I love the conversation. Love the conversation.
Yeah, and
really did.
Like I always say. By the way, before we go, what do you want to? Your websites you want to point people towards? I'll put a link in the description. Whatever you want to do, anything you want to promote, go ahead.
No. If you go to Book Depository and Google Alexander Bard, you can find my books if you're interested. I never sell anything. I stopped selling.
You also have a very, very interesting Wikipedia page.
I am one of the leaders of a new political party in Sweden at the moment. I've done several TV shows. If you're a Scandinavian, they all know who I am.
Yeah.
It's kind of nice to confront America from under the radar. I was a music producer in the past, the same thing there. I wasn't the artist, I was the producer. I've always worked a lot in America, and I work a lot with tech people, of course, but the people who should know who I am, they know who I am.
By the way, we both studied economics. Right? We both studied economics, but my cousin went to business school in Sweden, and he knew who you were right away.
Yeah.
So I was like, wow, that's interesting.
I love your show. I love your work. I think Gnostic Informant, great, Nick, by the way. I think it's great.
Thank you.
You're fantastic.
Yeah.
And where you based in, where was it, North Carolina?
I'm in Buffalo, New York.
You're Buffalo, New York. Great. Okay, then I know. Next time I come over, I'll let you know.
Absolutely. I'm 20 minutes away from Niagara Falls, so we can go see.
All right. I work from out of Toronto when I'm in North America. So yeah. That's where all the AI is.
That's a hop, skip, that's a few hours away. That's nothing.
Yeah.
So yeah, all right, well, you have just attained true Gnosis.
You have just attained true Gnosis. The demiurge has no power over you.